Hello, BookTube. I have a mean-spirited little poem to read to you today. I went back to the Oxford Book of English Verse, the Helen Gardner edition of the Oxford Book of English Verse, so not the older one, the Quiller Couch one. Still full of wonder. This is still one of my favorite poetry anthologies, one of the five that I have. And today we are going to Sir John Betjeman. Uh, and this is a poem of his. I don't. The Oxford Book of English Verse gives the date of the poem. This doesn't. It gives instead the dates of the poet, who was 1906 to 1984. And this is called The Death of King George V. Spirits of well-shot woodcock, partridge, snipe, flutter and bear him up the Norfolk sky. And in that red house, in a red mahogany bookcase, the stamp collection waits with mounts long dry. The big blue eyes are shut which saw wrong clothing, and favorite fields and covers from a horse. Old men in country houses hear clocks ticking over thick carpets with a deadened force. Old men who never cheated, never doubted, communicated monthly, sit and stare at the new suburbs stretched beyond the runway where a young man lands hatless from the air. And I would assume that if you saw the title of this poem, you would at least research who King George V is. Otherwise, you're not going to catch anything what's going on in here. But it's pretty mean. It's pretty mean-spirited. King George V was a small, petty, carping, smelly, stupid, vindictive man. He has been the subject of a good deal of reputation whitewashing in the last 70 years, but nevertheless, in fact, he just had a new biography that barely captures how noxious and horrible he was. And one of his prophetic pronouncements during his reign was that his son, uh, who everybody loved. His son was the Prince of Wales and was known all over the world as young, jet-setting, attractive, funny, personable. None of those things were true any more for him than they were for his father. But the father and the son didn't get along. The father and the second son did, and the second son went on to be king during World War II. But nobody knew that at first. Everybody assumed that the prince would become king, and in fact, of course, he did disastrously because he abdicated before even a full year had gone out on the throne. But this poem manages to slice and dice in two directions at the same time. This poet did not like either of these kings. So I wanted to explain the spirits of well-shot woodcock, partridge, and snipe flutter and bear him up in the Norfolk sky. That is is an allusion to the fact that George V did very little with his life other than kill animals. Very little. He did very little other than that. The idea of bear him up in the Norfolk sky is to produce this kind of comic, absurd version of, for instance, the numerous paintings of a dead Washington being borne up to heaven by angels. Instead, it's not angels; it's all these dead woodcock that the king killed over and over again. If he was feeling in a bad mood, he would slap a servant, then go out into the fields and kill hundreds, sometimes even thousands of birds. Just heaps of them. That maybe he would remember to authorize that they could at least go to the poor of the village. Sometimes he wouldn't. They just rot there. And if he didn't authorize it and you went to one of those heaps because your family made almost no money and you might starve and you thought, well, 4 game hens, that'll see us through the whole month and these are just going to rot in the sun. Otherwise, if you did that and he found out about it, he'd make sure that you were prosecuted by the local bailiff. So that's what that refers to, and also in that red house in a red mahogany bookcase, the stamp collection waits with mounts long dry, because in addition to killing mountains and mountains of birds, King George V was also an avid stamp collector, but not in the interesting way, right? Not in the interesting way. Think of some of the fairly wonkish collectors of different things that we have here on BookTube, how they make it interesting. How they know that it's a quirky little drive, but they know all the interesting stories. They know that it's not your drive, but they can still keep you involved. George V wasn't like that. He didn't need to be. He was the king. And it just goes on. It just keeps going in this mock heroic rhythm. It just keeps going on and on. The big blue eyes are shut, which saw wrong clothing. That's an allusion to the fact that George V was forever snapping at people for not being dressed the way he liked them to. And not just his servants. Anybody who came near him. You call that a waistcoat? What color is that for this month of the year? How those pant leg lengths are totally unacceptable. What's the matter with you? over and over again, to everybody, to everybody, to the despair of his wife, who was a far more interesting figure than he was. It seemed to be an obsession with him. And it's mentioned in passing in this poem. Old men in country houses hear clocks ticking over thick carpets with a deadened force. That may be an allusion to the fact that in one of his residences, King George V set the clocks ahead of time because he so hated people he thought were being non-punctual. He hated that so much, and everybody else hated it too. Everybody else hated the fact that if somebody showed up a minute late, they knew what the next 25 minutes were going to be like. 25 minutes, this little hob-faced monkey of a man would rage and rage and rage, with his wife telling him, okay, 5 minutes of raging about that was enough. It's a totally minor thing. What's wrong with you? His children would say, the children who stand to be around him would say, okay, 10 minutes you've been harping on that one functionary who was a few seconds late. 10 minutes straight of that. You can let it go. It's not that important. Nope, 20 minutes. So the clocks were set forward, and yet, with all that ire spent on the father, we still have some ire left for the boy, for the son, who flies. The newspaper has a quote from a daily newspaper: "New king arrives in his capital by air." The very first time that happened in English history, and the new king is King Edward. His family name was David, but he was going to take on the name King Edward. Didn't end up happening because he abdicated in order to marry the woman I love. But at first, he was a wildly popular king before people knew that he was willing to scuttle the monarchy for his own personal pleasure. And the last verse here, the last stanza, is directed at him. Old men who never cheated, never doubted, communicated monthly. All of that refers not to what those old men didn't do, but to what Edward was already famous for doing. He was famous for cheating, for doubting, for lapsing out of communication with the world or with the royal apparatus. For whole stretches of a self-indulgent time, he was famous for that. They sit and stare at a new suburb stretched beyond the runway where a young man lands hatless from the air. That is, I think Benjamin probably knew that if he didn't include the little epitaph with a quote from a paper, no one would get that line. I think it's quite good. It's quite good in terms of bashing of lesser Windsors. There's such a thing as state poetry. This is sort of the opposite of that. I always pity the state poets or the state-sponsored poets, the poet laureate, who has to come up with verse with mock heroic imagery like that. Only they have to mean it, or the irony has to be buried so deep that you don't know they're being ironic, so the public doesn't know they're being ironic. The annual tribute poem that had to be done to King George V or to his successor, I guarantee you, George VI read nothing except those poems. They were certainly the only poetry that he read since he was a boy. And he didn't have a very fine ear for whether or not he was being tweeted, whether or not he was being mocked. But I've always felt such pity for the poets who have to generate that kind of schlock. And as far as I know, they still do. I mean, Queen Elizabeth II is about as self-aware as you can want a monarch to be, but I don't think she's put a halt to it. I think she still gets a birthday poem. But anyway, that is that poem is the antithesis of that kind of poet laureate crapola. So I thought I'd read it to you, especially since I don't think we've had this poet before. But who knows what we'll have next time? We shall see. I will rejoin with you then. Thank you.